Chapter 5. The First Real Goodbye. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold as Audrielle and Evan lingered in the old hunting lodge. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm shadows that danced across the wooden beams and faded tapestries. The lodge, forgotten by time and unused for years, had become their haven, a place where the weight of duty and the eyes of the world could not reach them. Evan sat beside Audrielle on the worn leather sofa, his arm resting along the back, his fingers lightly grazing her shoulder. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat soothing her restless thoughts. They hadn't spoken much since she'd arrived. The silence between them was heavy, but not unwelcome. It was the kind of quiet that allowed their emotions to breathe, untangled by the need for words. "I wish we could stay here forever," Audrielle said softly, her voice breaking the stillness. Evan sighed, his fingers brushing through her hair. "If only we could," he replied, his voice laced with regret. "But forever isn't ours to have." Audrielle closed her eyes, the ache in her chest growing sharper. She knew the truth of his words, yet it didn't make them any easier to accept. The minutes they stole together were precious, but they were fleeting, and the knowledge of their inevitable parting hung over them like a shadow. "Do you ever think," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "what it might have been like if things were different? If we'd met as ordinary people?" Evan tilted her chin up gently, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Every day," he admitted. "I imagine what it would be like to love you openly, to walk beside you without fear, to build a life together that's truly ours." Audrielle's eyes filled with tears, and she turned her face away, unable to bear the raw intensity of his gaze. "Why does it have to be this way?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Evan leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "Because the world we were born into isn't fair," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean we stop fighting for what we can have." The sound of horses in the distance startled them both. Audrielle stiffened, her body tense as Evan rose quickly, moving to the window. He pulled back the faded curtain just enough to peer outside, his expression darkening. "They're looking for you," he said grimly. "Your father's guards." Audrielle's stomach twisted. She had been careful, making sure no one saw her leave the palace, but it seemed her absence had been noticed. She stood, her heart racing as the reality of their situation crashed over her. "I can't let them find me here," she said, her voice shaking. "If they see us together." "They won't," Evan said firmly, turning to face her. "You'll go back, and they'll think you were riding the outer grounds." Audrielle looked at him, her chest tightening. "And what about you? If they see you here?" "I'll manage," he interrupted, his tone steady. "Your safety is what matters." She hesitated, her instincts warring with her reason. She didn't want to leave him, not when every moment they shared felt so fragile, but she knew he was right. She couldn't risk exposing them both. Evan stepped closer, his hands gripping her arms gently. "Audrielle," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "Look at me." She lifted her gaze to his, her vision blurred by unshed tears. His expression was resolute, but there was a tenderness in his eyes that broke her heart. "We'll find another moment," he promised. "Another place. This isn't the end." She nodded, swallowing hard as she fought to steady her breathing. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Promise me this isn't the last time." Evan cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I promise," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "You're not losing me." The minutes that followed passed in a blur. Evan helped Audrielle wrap her cloak around her shoulders, his hands lingering on her arms as he adjusted the hood to conceal her face. She slipped out of the lodge through a hidden side entrance, the faint sound of her father's guards growing louder as they neared the main path. Evan watched from the window as she disappeared into the woods, his heart heavy with both relief and longing. He hated letting her go, hated the way the world conspired to keep them apart. But he knew they had no choice, not yet. Audrielle rode back to the palace, her heart pounding with every hoofbeat. By the time she reached the gates, her cheeks were flushed, her hair windswept. The guards stationed there barely glanced at her as she entered, assuming she had been on one of her usual solitary rides. As she returned to her chambers, she felt the weight of their parting settle over her. The brief hours they had shared at the lodge were already slipping into memory, leaving her with a mix of joy and sorrow. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling as the tears she had been holding back finally fell. In his chambers at the guest wing of the palace, Evan sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The glow illuminated his face, casting shadows that reflected the turmoil in his heart. He thought of Audrielle, of her laughter, her touch, the way she had looked at him in the lodge. She was the one thing in his life that felt real, and he wasn't going to let her go, no matter the cost. The crackling fire filled the silence, and Evan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. The world was full of barriers, of expectations and rules that sought to dictate their lives. But as far as he was concerned, those barriers were meant to be broken. For Audrielle, he would break them all. Chapter 6. Bound by Duty. The days following their secret meeting at the hunting lodge passed in a blur of obligations for Audrielle. Preparations for her engagement announcement to Duke Laurent consumed her time and energy, leaving little room for her thoughts to wander to Evan, or so her family hoped. But no matter how many seamstresses fussed over her gowns or how many rehearsals she endured for the engagement ceremony, Evan lingered in her mind like a quiet rebellion. Meanwhile, Evan had returned to Valoria to attend to his own duties. The separation was both a relief and a torment for Audrielle. The distance made their love feel safer, less precarious, but it also deepened the ache of missing him. Every moment apart felt like a test of their resolve. The night of the engagement announcement arrived too quickly. Castillon Palace was transformed into a glittering spectacle, with banners bearing the royal crest draped across the marble balconies. Nobles and dignitaries filled the grand ballroom, their laughter and chatter echoing through the gilded halls. Audrielle stood in her chambers, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her gown, a masterpiece of gold and ivory silk, shimmered under the glow of the chandeliers. Her ladies-in-waiting adjusted the delicate crown that rested atop her dark hair, their chatter a distant hum. "You look radiant, Your Highness," one of them said, stepping back to admire her work. Audrielle forced a smile, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She didn't feel radiant. She felt trapped, like a bird in a cage too beautiful to be resented, but too confining to be ignored. Her heart ached for the freedom she had tasted in Evan's arms, for the quiet moments in the garden and the stolen hours at the lodge. "Are you ready, princess?" Her mother's voice cut through her thoughts. Audrielle turned to see Queen Marielle standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. With a deep breath, Audrielle nodded. "I am." The queen approached, her eyes softening slightly as she placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You're doing what's best for the kingdom," she said quietly. "You know that, don't you?" Audrielle swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded again. "Yes, mother." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The ballroom erupted into applause as Audrielle entered on her father's arm. The crowd parted like the sea, their eyes fixed on her as she descended the grand staircase. At the bottom, Duke Laurent waited, his polished demeanor unshaken as he extended his hand to her. "Your Grace," she said softly, placing her hand in his. "Your Highness," he replied, bowing slightly. His voice was pleasant, his expression kind, but there was no spark in his gaze. He looked at her the way one might admire a painting, appreciative but distant. As they moved to the center of the room, the orchestra began to play a slow waltz. The assembled guests watched with rapt attention as they danced, their steps flawless but mechanical. Audrielle's mind drifted as Laurent spoke about his plans for their future, his words blurring into the music. And then, she saw him. Evan stood near the edge of the ballroom, his dark eyes fixed on her. He was dressed in the formal attire of his station, but there was a storm behind his composed facade. Audrielle's breath caught, her steps faltering for the briefest of moments. Laurent noticed, but said nothing, assuming her hesitation was due to nerves. Evan's gaze didn't waver as she twirled across the floor. He didn't need to speak for her to understand what he was saying. "I'm here. I'm watching. You're not alone." The music ended, and the applause brought Audrielle back to the present. Laurent escorted her to the dais, where her father and the Duke of Trivern awaited to make the official announcement. As her father's voice boomed through the ballroom, proclaiming the union that would solidify their kingdom's alliances, Audrielle's eyes found Evan once more. He gave the slightest nod, a subtle but powerful gesture of reassurance. It was enough to steady her as she curtsied and accepted Laurent's hand again. Hours later, as the guests dispersed and the palace quieted, Audrielle slipped away from her chambers. The corridors were dimly lit, the flickering sconces casting long shadows on the stone walls. Her heart pounded as she made her way to the private library, a place they had agreed would be their meeting spot should Evan find a way to return. She pushed open the heavy oak door to find him standing near the window, his silhouette illuminated by the moonlight. He turned at the sound of her entrance, his expression softening as their eyes met. "You came," she said, her voice trembling with relief. Evan crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms. "I told you I wouldn't let you go," he murmured, his voice a mix of anger and longing. "How could I stay away when they're parading you around like some prize to be won?" Audrielle clung to him, her fingers gripping the fabric of his coat. "I don't want this," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't want him. I don't want this life." Evan pulled back, his hands cupping her face. "Then come with me," he said, his voice urgent. "Leave this all behind. We'll run, Audrielle. We'll find a place where no one knows who we are, where we can be free." Her heart ached at the intensity in his eyes. "You know I can't," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't abandon my family, my people." Evan's jaw tightened, and he pulled her close again, his arms wrapping around her protectively. "Then we'll fight," he said softly. "We'll find a way to keep what we have, no matter what." Audrielle closed her eyes, savoring the warmth of his embrace. She didn't know how they would navigate the impossible road ahead, but for now, in this stolen moment, she let herself believe they could. Chapter 7. A Dangerous Proposal. The days following Evan's return were a storm of conflicting emotions for Audrielle. Their meeting in the library had left her shaken yet hopeful. For a brief moment, she had believed they might find a way to defy the world and claim their love. But as reality closed in, her hope was shadowed by fear. The eyes of the court were everywhere, and the threads of suspicion were tightening. Evan, too, felt the pressure mounting. He had spent sleepless nights strategizing, his mind racing through possibilities. The alliance between their kingdoms was delicate, and any misstep could lead to political ruin or, worse, war. Yet, no matter how dire the stakes, one thing remained clear: he couldn't lose Audrielle. One evening, Evan requested a private meeting with King Galen under the guise of strengthening their kingdom's trade agreements. The king, intrigued by the suggestion, invited Evan to his study, a grand chamber filled with shelves of leather-bound books and a sprawling oak desk. Evan entered the room with his usual confidence, bowing respectfully. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice steady. "Thank you for granting me your time." King Galen gestured for him to sit. "What's on your mind, Prince Evan? I hear you've been making an impression at court." Evan smiled faintly, masking the tension brewing beneath his composed exterior. "I hope I've done so in a favorable light," he said smoothly. "I've been observing the preparations for Princess Audrielle's engagement announcement. I must say, her union with Duke Laurent will no doubt fortify the bonds between our kingdoms." The king's brow lifted, intrigued. "It will indeed," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "But I sense there's more you wish to discuss." Evan hesitated for a moment, carefully choosing his words. "With all due respect, Your Majesty, I can't help but question whether this is the best path for her or for Castillon." King Galen's eyes narrowed. "Explain yourself." Evan leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Audrielle is a remarkable woman. Intelligent, compassionate, and capable of inspiring great loyalty. A union with Laurent may solidify alliances, but it doesn't serve the heart of the kingdom." The king studied him, his gaze sharp. "You speak as though you know my daughter well." Evan held his ground, though his heart pounded. "I've had the privilege of speaking with her on several occasions. She deserves a partner who understands her strengths, who values her not just as a political asset, but as a person." "And you believe Laurent isn't that man?" the king pressed. Evan hesitated but decided to push forward. "I believe there are alternatives worth considering." That evening, Audrielle paced her chambers, her nerves fraying. Evan's boldness terrified her, yet she couldn't deny the flicker of hope his actions inspired. When she received word from a servant that he had returned to the palace after meeting with her father, she immediately arranged for them to meet in the stables under cover of darkness. The smell of hay and leather filled the quiet barn as Audrielle entered, her cloak pulled tightly around her. Evan was already waiting, his expression grim but determined. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Evan stepped forward, his hands reaching for hers. "I spoke to your father," he admitted, his tone calm but firm. "I couldn't stay silent anymore, Audrielle. He needs to know you have other options." Audrielle stared at him, her heart racing. "Other options? Evan, do you realize what you've done? If he suspects anything—" "He doesn't," Evan interrupted, his grip on her hands tightening. "I was careful. I framed it as a matter of strategy. But Audrielle, we can't keep living like this. Something has to change." Her chest ached with the weight of his words. She wanted to believe in his courage, to trust that they could bend the world to their will. But the consequences of failure loomed too large. "What did he say?" she asked quietly. Evan's jaw tightened. "He didn't dismiss me outright. He's considering it. But he'll need convincing." Audrielle's brow furrowed. "And how do you propose we do that?" Evan's eyes softened as he reached up to cup her cheek. "By showing him what's at stake," he said. "We have to make him see that what we have is worth more than any alliance." Audrielle closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "And if he doesn't? If he refuses to listen?" Evan's voice dropped, his tone resolute. "Then we make our own way." Their conversation was cut short by the sound of approaching voices. Evan's hand fell from her cheek as they both turned toward the stable doors. The shadows of two guards appeared, their lanterns casting long beams of light across the straw-covered floor. Audrielle's heart raced as Evan pulled her into the shadows behind a row of stalls. They pressed close, the heat of his body grounding her as the guards entered the barn. "Check the far end," one of them said. The princess was seen heading this way. Audrielle's breath caught. Evan's arm wrapped around her waist, holding her steady as they listened to the guard's footsteps echo through the barn. She clutched his coat, her pulse pounding in her ears. After what felt like an eternity, the guards turned and left, their voices fading into the night. Audrielle exhaled shakily, her forehead resting against Evan's chest. "This is too dangerous," she whispered. "We're going to get caught." Evan tilted her chin up, his dark eyes filled with determination. "Then let's stop hiding," he said. "Let's show them what we're fighting for." Audrielle's heart ached with both fear and hope. She didn't know how they would navigate the impossible road ahead, but as she looked into Evan's eyes, she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let him go. Chapter 8. A Kingdom Divided. The days following their meeting in the stables were marked by an agonizing wait. Evan's words lingered in Audrielle's mind, a quiet rebellion against the reality of her life. She moved through her days with a forced composure, attending to her duties while stealing glances at her father during council meetings, wondering what he was thinking, whether Evan's boldness had swayed him. Evan, too, felt the strain. Back in the guest wing of Castillon Palace, he worked tirelessly to fortify his position, meeting with allies and seeking opportunities to appeal to the king's sense of strategy. His every move was calculated, but the stakes felt impossibly high. He knew that if King Galen refused to reconsider Audrielle's engagement to Laurent, their love would remain a secret buried beneath the weight of royal obligations. The turning point came on a crisp morning when King Galen summoned Audrielle to his private study. She entered the grand chamber with trepidation, her steps slow and deliberate. The king sat behind his imposing oak desk, his expression unreadable as he gestured for her to take a seat. "Father," she said softly, folding her hands in her lap. King Galen leaned back in his chair, studying her with a piercing gaze. "Audrielle," he began, his tone measured, "Prince Evan has made an unusual request on your behalf." Her breath hitched, but she forced herself to remain calm. "A request?" The king's lips pressed into a thin line. "He believes your union with Laurent may not be the most advantageous course for our kingdom." Audrielle's heart raced. She struggled to find the right words, knowing that one misstep could unravel everything. "And what do you think?" she asked carefully. The king sighed, his expression softening slightly. "I think Evan is a persuasive man. He speaks with conviction, and it's clear he holds you in high regard." Audrielle's cheeks flushed, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on her father. "But," the king continued, his voice growing firm, "this is not a matter of personal affection. It is a matter of politics and stability. Lawrence's family has been a steadfast ally for generations. To sever that bond now would be reckless." Audrielle's chest tightened. "Father," she said, her voice trembling, "surely there is more to consider than politics. Shouldn't my happiness matter?" King Galen's expression darkened. "Your happiness is a luxury, Audrielle, one that is often sacrificed for the greater good. You were born into a role that demands loyalty to your people above all else." Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "And what of my heart?" she asked quietly. "Am I to ignore it completely?" The king's gaze softened for a moment, but the resolve in his eyes remained unyielding. "You must trust that this is the right path," he said. "For you and for Castillon." Audrielle left the study feeling hollow. The weight of her father's words pressed heavily on her chest, and for the first time, she felt the true scope of the battle she and Evan were fighting. It wasn't just a fight for their love, it was a fight against a lifetime of expectations, against a system that valued alliances over emotions. That evening, she met Evan in the gardens, their usual place of refuge. The cool night air was filled with the scent of jasmine, and the soft rustling of leaves provided a sense of privacy they desperately needed. "He won't change his mind," Audrielle said, her voice trembling as she recounted her conversation with the king. "He's too focused on the alliance with Laurent." Evan's jaw tightened, his dark eyes burning with frustration. "Then we'll have to force his hand," he said. "There has to be a way to make him see that what we have is worth fighting for." Audrielle shook her head, her tears finally spilling over. "How, Evan? How can we fight a system that's been in place for centuries? They'll never let us be together." Evan pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she sobbed into his chest. "We'll find a way," he murmured, his voice firm despite the anguish in his eyes. "I won't let them take you from me." The next day, news of Audrielle's engagement ceremony reached Evan like a blow to the chest. The event was to be held in 2 weeks, a grand spectacle designed to solidify the alliance between Castillon and Trivern. It was the final step before the wedding, a public declaration of a union that would bind Audrielle to Laurent forever. Evan knew they were running out of time. He sought out allies among the nobles and courtiers, quietly building support for his cause. Some dismissed him as reckless, but others, moved by his passion and sincerity, began to listen. His plan was ambitious, dangerous even, but it was the only chance they had. On the evening of the engagement ceremony, Audrielle stood in her chambers, her heart heavy as her ladies-in-waiting prepared her for the event. Her gown, a masterpiece of crimson and gold, shimmered in the candlelight, but it felt like a shroud rather than a celebration. She stared at her reflection, her stomach churning with dread. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When the maid opened it, a young page entered, bowing low as he handed Audrielle a sealed letter. Her heart raced as she broke the seal, recognizing Evan's handwriting immediately. "Tonight, midnight, the old chapel. Trust me." Her breath caught, and for the first time that day, a flicker of hope ignited within her. She folded the note carefully, hiding it among the folds of her gown. Whatever Evan had planned, she would follow him. Chapter 9. The Midnight Chapel. The palace was alive with celebration, the grand halls filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of crystal goblets. Audrielle moved through the engagement ceremony like a ghost, her face a mask of regal composure while her mind raced with anticipation. Midnight could not come soon enough. Duke Laurent stood beside her, ever the picture of politeness, his hand lightly resting on hers as they greeted dignitaries. He spoke of alliances and future plans with practiced charm, but Audrielle barely heard him. Her thoughts were consumed by Evan's letter, by the promise of the old chapel, and by the hope that had sparked despite the impossible odds. As the clock neared midnight, Audrielle feigned exhaustion, requesting to retire early. Laurent, ever dutiful, escorted her to the doors of her chambers before bidding her good night with a formal bow. The moment the door closed, she shed her heavy gown, slipping into a simple cloak and soft-soled slippers. Her heart thundered in her chest as she opened the secret passage hidden behind the wardrobe, a narrow, winding staircase that led to the palace gardens. The air was cool and still as she hurried through the shadows, the towering trees and fragrant blooms offering cover as she made her way to the old chapel. The small stone building, long abandoned and overgrown with ivy, stood at the edge of the estate. Its worn facade glowed faintly in the moonlight, a beacon calling her to the man she loved. Evan was waiting for her at the entrance, his silhouette strong and sure against the night. He turned as she approached, his face lighting up with relief and longing. "You came," he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. Audrielle stepped into his arms without hesitation, her hands gripping the fabric of his coat as though anchoring herself to him. "Of course I came," she whispered. "I would follow you anywhere." Inside the chapel, the air was heavy with the scent of aged wood and crumbling stone. Moonlight streamed through the shattered stained glass windows, casting colorful shards of light across the floor. Evan led her to the altar, where a single candle flickered, its glow illuminating the solemn determination in his eyes. "I have a plan," he said, turning to face her. "But it's dangerous, Audrielle. If we fail—" She placed a finger to his lips, silencing him. "I don't care about the risks," she said firmly. "Tell me what we must do." Evan took her hands, his grip steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "We leave tonight," he said. "There's a ship waiting at the southern port, ready to take us far from here. If we go now, before anyone notices your absence, we can be gone before dawn." Audrielle's breath caught. "Leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But my family, my kingdom." "Will survive," Evan interrupted, his tone gentle but resolute. "This isn't just about us, Audrielle. If we stay, you'll be bound to Laurent, and I'll be forced to watch the woman I love become a prisoner of duty. I can't do it. I won't." Tears welled in her eyes as she searched his face, seeing the depth of his love and the strength of his conviction. "And what kind of life will we have?" she asked softly. "Running, hiding, always looking over our shoulders?" Evan cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. "A life where we're free," he said. "A life where we can be together without fear or pretense. It won't be easy, but it will be ours." Audrielle closed her eyes, her mind racing. She thought of her father's stern face, her mother's quiet sorrow, Laurent's polite but distant presence. She thought of the weight of the crown, the expectations she had carried since birth. And then she thought of Evan, his touch, his words, the way he made her feel truly seen and loved. "I'll come with you," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Whatever lies ahead, we'll face it together." Evan's arms wrapped around her, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "You've just made me the happiest man alive," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. They lingered in the chapel for a moment longer, savoring the closeness, the quiet before the storm. Then, with their decision made, they turned toward the door, ready to begin their journey into the unknown. But as they stepped outside, their escape was cut short by the sound of voices and the glow of torches in the distance. Guards were approaching, their shouts echoing through the night. "They found us," Audrielle whispered, her heart pounding. Evan grabbed her hand, his grip firm. "We'll find another way," he said, his voice calm despite the urgency in his movements. "Stay close to me." Together, they ran into the woods, the torches of the guards growing brighter with every passing moment. The night was alive with the sound of pursuit, snapping branches, heavy footsteps, and the frantic beating of their hearts. Audrielle's cloak snagged on a low branch, and she stumbled, but Evan was there in an instant, pulling her to her feet. "We're almost there," he said, his voice a quiet promise. They broke through the tree-line and emerged onto the cliffside overlooking the sea. Below, the faint outline of a ship rocked gently in the moonlit waves, its sails ready to carry them to freedom. But the guards were closing in, their torches casting long shadows on the rocky path. Evan turned to her, his dark eyes blazing with determination. "Go," he said, his voice firm. "I'll hold them off." Audrielle shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, I'm not leaving you. You must, he insisted, his hands gripping her shoulders. If they take us both, it's over. But if you make it to the ship, we still have a chance. Her chest ached with the weight of his words, but she knew he was right. With a final, desperate kiss, she turned and ran toward the path leading down to the shore. Behind her, she heard the clash of steel as Evan confronted the guards, his defiance echoing into the night. Chapter 10. The Final Sacrifice. The cliffside wind whipped Audrielle's hair as she stumbled down the narrow path toward the shore. Every step was agony, her heart torn between the safety of escape and the knowledge that Evan was fighting alone. Above her, the sounds of the skirmish grew louder, shouts, the clash of swords, and Evan's unmistakable voice, commanding and unyielding. She reached the beach, her feet sinking into the sand as the waves lapped at the shore. The ship was just offshore, its silhouette stark against the moonlit water. A small dinghy waited nearby, manned by a cloaked figure who waved her over urgently. "Princess," the sailor called, his voice low but urgent. "Quickly, we must go." Audrielle hesitated, her chest heaving as she turned back toward the cliff. She could see the flicker of torches moving closer to the edge, the guards closing in. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her heart refused to leave Evan behind. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't leave him." The sailor leapt from the dinghy and grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not unkind. "If you stay, they'll take you both," he said. "He's buying you time. Don't let it be for nothing." Tears streamed down Audrielle's face as she looked back one last time. The torches had reached the edge of the cliff, and she could hear Evan's voice, sharp and commanding, rising above the chaos. Her knees buckled, but the sailor held her steady, guiding her into the dinghy. The small boat cut through the waves with agonizing slowness as the sailor rowed toward the waiting ship. Audrielle gripped the sides, her hands trembling as she strained to hear anything over the roar of the ocean. The distance grew between her and the shore, but the battle above the cliff raged on in her mind. By the time they reached the ship, the adrenaline that had carried her this far began to fade, replaced by an all-consuming dread. The crew helped her aboard, their expressions grim as they prepared to set sail. The ship's captain approached her, his weathered face filled with quiet sympathy. "Is there anyone else coming?" he asked. Audrielle shook her head, her voice too broken to respond. She clutched the rail, staring back at the shoreline, hoping for a miracle. On the cliffside, Evan stood his ground. He had disarmed 2 guards already, his movements swift and precise despite the odds against him. His sword clashed against another's, the force of the impact reverberating through his arms. He could feel the weight of exhaustion creeping in, but he pushed it aside. Every second he held them back was another second Audrielle had to escape. "Where's the princess?" one of the guards demanded, his tone sharp. Evan smirked, blood trickling from a cut on his cheek. "Far beyond your reach," he said, his voice steady. "And that's where she'll stay." The guard lunged, but Evan sidestepped, using the momentum to knock him to the ground. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever, but he didn't need to. All that mattered was that Audrielle made it to the ship. On the deck of the ship, Audrielle gripped the rail so tightly her knuckles turned white. The sails were unfurled, and the crew worked quickly to guide the vessel out to sea. But her eyes never left the cliffs. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn back, to do something, to save him. And then, as the ship drifted farther from the shore, she saw it, a figure silhouetted against the torches. Her breath caught, hope flaring as she realized it was Evan. He stood at the edge of the cliff, his sword raised defiantly, his posture unbroken despite the guards surrounding him. "Evan," she cried, her voice carrying across the water. His head turned toward her, and, even from the distance, she could feel the intensity of his gaze. He didn't speak, but the way he stood, the way he looked at her was enough. It was a goodbye and a promise all at once. Then, with one final clash of steel, the guards overwhelmed him. Audrielle screamed, her knees giving way as she collapsed onto the deck. The crew moved to pull her away from the railing, but she fought them, her cries echoing into the night. She strained to see the cliffside, but it had disappeared into the distance, swallowed by the darkness. Hours passed, but Audrielle remained on the deck, her tears long since dried. The crew gave her space, their eyes heavy with pity as they worked around her. She clutched Evan's cloak, which she had brought with her, the fabric still carrying his scent. She thought of his smile, his touch, the fire in his eyes when he told her they would find a way. And though her heart was shattered, she clung to the belief that his sacrifice had not been in vain. He had fought for her freedom, for their love, and she would carry that with her for the rest of her life. Months later, in a distant kingdom, rumors began to spread of a princess who had defied her fate, choosing love over duty. Her story became a legend whispered in the halls of power, a symbol of rebellion and hope for those who dared to dream of a life beyond the confines of tradition. And though Audrielle lived in exile, her heart never truly left the cliffs of Castillon. She would often sit by the sea, gazing out at the horizon, and whisper his name into the wind. Evan. In her dreams, he was always there, standing tall and unbroken, his love for her a light that could never be extinguished.